Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called Film Noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. Today's podcast is devoted to both versions of Kiss Me Deadly, the best-selling 1952 novel by Mickey Spillane, featuring his hard-boiled private eye, Mike Hammer, and the 1955 film adaptation, directed by Robert Aldrich. My guest is Mark Dillon, an award-winning Toronto-based journalist specialising in film, TV and pop music. He is a former editor of Playback, the business publication for the Canadian media industries and to which he still contributes. He has been writing for Hollywood magazine American Cinematographer for more than 25 years. He is also the author of 50 Sides of the Beach Boys, chronicling America's band, and co-hosts the non-noir related podcast Surf's Up, a Beach Boys podcast safari. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's brilliant to have you.
Sergio, thanks so much for having me.
Before we get stuck into film noir, which is what we're mostly going to be talking about, I wanted to ask you quickly about your podcast, which is devoted to the Beach Boys. Could you tell us a little bit about Surf's Up, a Beach Boy podcast safari?
Yeah, so I wrote a book about the Beach Boys in 2012. So that was celebrating their 50th anniversary. The book's called 50 Sides of the Beach Boys. And just very quickly, I mean, it celebrated their 50th anniversary by looking at every chapter is a song, and every song is discussed through the perspective of somebody different. So one of the Beach Boys, one of their collaborators, a rock star from the 60s, a rock star from today. So that's my contribution to the pop music world. And then after that, I got into this podcast with a gentleman named Phil Migliorati down in Florida. And so we have on a lot of guests, same kind of idea as my book, I guess, people that have worked with the Beach Boys or people who have written about the Beach Boys. And you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. There is an audio version of the book as well, yes, and a digital version.
It looks fantastic, and I'm a big Beach Boys fan. I mean, as I say, Pet Sounds gets played a lot in my place. So, I realize that makes me a very conventional Beach Boys fan by your standards, but it's wonderful stuff.
And the Brits were always a little quicker to appreciate the brilliance of the Beach Boys than the Americans were, and Pet Sounds is proof positive of that.
Although, of course, I'm all the way from Italy, so I don't really count, but never mind. Mum's English, but I'm originally from Rome in Italy. So,
how big are the Beach Boys over there?
You know what? It's one of those things that they had a really big kind of pop industry in Italy. And oddly enough, I mean, yeah, it's not like they wouldn't have heard them, and it's not like they wouldn't have toured. Same goes for the Beatles, Rolling Stones. But in actual fact, it didn't penetrate nearly as much as it would in obvious Anglophone territories. Let's put it that way. Although the Italians have a gigantic inferiority complex when they assume if it's in English, it must be better, which is ridiculous. If you go to Italy and it's kind of every other cafe's got an English name, every other kind of social type thing tends to have something that makes it sound a bit American or a bit British, not French, not German, not Spanish. No, it's got to be English to give it somehow. You tend to go to things like the Jolly Cafe, which is just where you get Italian coffee. It's just utterly ridiculous.
You go all the way to Rome and then you drink at the Jolly Cafe. That's crazy.
Well, can I tell you, there's a lot of them. Oh, admittedly, well, also because it's actually to do with playing cards. The Joker is called the Jolly. There you go. It's stuff like that. Bizarre. Now, the other side I wanted to ask you about very quickly, which is, of course, you are connected through blood to one of the great filmmakers of the 20th century. Please tell me more.
My mother is a Pressburger. My grandfather, who I'm named after, Mark Pressburger was his name, was first cousins with Emmerich Pressburger, who, of course, was the Oscar-winning screenwriter in the Powell and Pressburger partnership. I'm sure, as many of your listeners know, they, in the 1940s especially, made some of the greatest films of all time, The Red Shoes, A Matter of Life and Death, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, Black Narcissus, and even one movie that I would call noir, The Small Back Room. So, yeah, I've always been very proud of that family connection. And family connection or not, I love those films that they made.
I'm such a huge fan. I did my master's thesis on Powell's films, but you have several strings to your bow. You also write for American Cinematographer. And in fact, I was just reading one of your pieces. I was reading your piece on the Netflix series Ripley.
Yes.
I haven't seen it yet. It sounds extremely noir.
Yeah, I mean, I think the filmmakers may shy away from noir, but a lot of people are calling it that. I mean, certainly stunning black and white photography. It's one of the best looking shows ever made, I think. Just won the Emmy for cinematography. I mean, I loved it. I mean, it is such a painstakingly slow series. I mean, it goes into every minute detail that this Ripley character, everything he does to get away with his crimes and subterfuge. So either you get really immersed into it or not, but I certainly did. And just stunning cinematography by the great Robert Aldrich.
Yeah, I mean, and it was one of those films that was shot digitally and strictly speaking, in color and then rendered into black and white. Is that correct?
It is. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Like a lot of people, a lot of viewers seem to bristle at the fact that it was in black and white. Like, why did they have to do it in black and white? Like, I know they save money. I'm like, what a ridiculous comment. They didn't save any money because, as you said, they shot it in color and then just drained the color from it digitally. They had two versions at the ready because there was a conversation with Netflix. Netflix was not so sure about releasing it in black and white, so they had to protect themselves. So they had a color version, they had a black and white version, but Steve Zilian, who directed it, stuck to his guns and he insisted on the black and white version. And hey, it paid off because it's done very well, very highly acclaimed, and won an Emmy for the cinematography. So I don't think we're ever going to see the color version.
Great. Frankly, that's not the kind of extra I don't need, frankly. But also, I'm totally looking forward to it because reading your excellent article, one of the things that came through was how much they seem to have drawn on very much those Italian 60s films, which are so beautifully shot. I mean, there's a great melancholy about even the most commercial of Italian films. Even their comedies tend to be extremely sad, frankly, but they always look fabulous. So, okay, we've reached noir territory. So I ask everyone the same two icebreaker questions. And the first one is, what's your definition of film noir?
I've got a bit of a canned answer for you, but here we go. So to me, film noir is a movement that took off in cinema in the 1940s, influenced by the German expressionistic style that we saw in silent horror films predominantly, 1920s, the dark, shadowy look and a bit of a distorted perspective of reality, which I think gives life to the character's inner turmoil and evokes the sense of fatalism. Film noir, to me, presents a nocturnal, nightmare version of the everyday world. And I think it was popular during World War II because with all the death and mechanized destruction that was going on, it made the world, in fact, a nightmare. People were paranoid, their psyches were damaged. And I think that was transposed from the battlefields to the streets of New York or LA or what have you.
So with that in mind, then, can you recall when was the first time you saw a film noir? I mean, what was it and when was it?
I was trying to figure out how old I was. I was very young, and I will estimate I was 10. I was not a kid who went to summer camp. I stayed home during the summer. I grew up in Montreal, and I remember one summer in particular, we got this ABC station out of the US from Poland Spring, Maine, ABC affiliate. And every morning they would have a classic movie. So I would start my day by watching one of these old movies. And I hadn't had much exposure to classic cinema before then, but I just went with it. And they really specialized, I would say, in film noir. And I don't know which one I got to first, but I do remember in that first batch, there was Double Indemnity, Conflict, starring Humphrey Bogart, and In a Lonely Place, starring Humphrey Bogart. And these movies had quite a big effect on me at the time and really turned me into a classic film lover for life.
Yeah, I mean, I think Conflict's just about due to come out on Blu-ray. In fact, I think Warner Brothers is finally putting it out. But, oh yeah, three sensational films. Very depressing movies on the whole. Not a happy ending in any of those, which is perfect.
They creeped me out. They really creeped me out,
yeah.
those movies.
I mean, you certainly got a primer there. Fantastic movies, all three of them, though. Which neatly brings us to Kiss Me Deadly, the film that you suggested would be great to talk about. And it is a fantastic film. And also, I think it's one of those films that you can still watch it be thrilled by it. And then there's still lots to talk about. You know, there are some older films, let's put it that way, where there's a kind of distancing effect. You can't quite connect to the era as easily. It all seems a bit too remote. So it's more fun to talk about than it is to try and experience. And yet I think you see this one and it has this kind of visceral quality. I mean, what is it that draws you to this particular film?
Well, let me tell you how my obsession for this film started. So, as I was that young film noir fan, there was a TV show that was on in the US in the 1980s. It was Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer. So, this was
Stacey Keach.
With Stacy Keach, a great actor. So, with some interruption, of course, he went to jail for drug possession in the middle of it.
In the UK, yeah.
So the show was on from 1983 to 1989, and I loved it. I mean, I had no previous connection to Mickey Spillane's writing or the Mike Hammer character, but this one was really good because it was nostalgic and it was funny. It was very tongue in cheek. It was very enjoyable. And Stacy Keach, very charismatic. So I love that. And then, I was always reading up about old movies, and then I read about Kiss Me Deadly. I hope it's not too much of a spoiler, but I read that this movie has a mushroom cloud in it. And I was like trying to wrap my head around what exactly this would be. And so I just sort of in my head tried to imagine what this movie could have been like. I could picture how it would be if I had been the filmmaker. But this was a different age when movies were not so readily available, and it wasn't at the local video store. I had to wait to see it. I remember I had an art teacher. He had seen it, and I was so jealous, and I was like, what is it like? What is it like? And he said, oh, it's really weird. And he liked it. And so I was like in art class, I was like imagining posters for the movie. So I was like obsessed with it. And then finally at Concordia University in Montreal, they had a film noir festival, I guess. And they played it. And I was so excited. Like I brought all my friends and all this. And I have to say, it was not exactly what I had in my head. So I had to sort of get over what I thought it might be and sort of deal with the reality of the movie. I mean, that was 40 years ago. So I've had a lot of time to to absorb what the movie really is. And but I'm just as obsessed with it for what it is than for what I imagined it would be. Yeah, it's a movie that is out there, like you say. It's not boxed in so much by the conventions of its time. It's an extremely irreverent movie. I think some of it is quite shocking by today's standards, and it is very modern and certainly has been influential.
I suspect this is one of those films where we're going to have to talk about spoilers, and we will have to talk about the ending, because the ending itself, which after all exists in two versions, and you will have seen the not good version, presumably first time out, same as me. So we'll probably warn listeners right now, yes, we're going to talk about the ending, bad luck. Before we started recording, you and I were sort of comparing notes about the novel. So what page did you reach of the book by Mickey Spillane?
Well, I got my little pocketbook here. I bought this a long time ago. Anyway, I essentially want to read it just to compare it to the film. And I tried again this summer. I was at the beach and I brought it as my beach read. And I got to page 38 and I couldn't get much further. I mean, every second page, he's describing how beautiful a woman is, or specifically how beautiful his secretary Velda is, and it becomes a little bit tedious. It's not quite like the movie, but as you mentioned in our chat beforehand, there are more similarities to the movie than some people might give it credit for.
Yeah, I mean, the book is very, I suppose you could say, very typical of its time. I mean, obviously these were enormously successful. The James Bond books by Ian Fleming wouldn't have been the same if it hadn't been for the Mickey Spillane books, for the Mike Hammer series. I don't think there's any question about that. The kind of cruelty and sadism, the focus on sort of revenge narratives, clearly derived from that successful formula. So you can't underestimate that. I think the figure that always gets used is that there were, by the time the film came out, well over 100 million paperback copies of these books were out there, which is just astonishing. I don't know if it's even true, but even if it's only half true, that's just amazing. Even in the days when, okay, maybe everything only cost 25 cents in the States. And yet at the cinema, he was not doing well, because none of the films up to that point have really been particularly interesting. Spillane got lots of offers, and yet at the same time, there was, I think critically the perception was that these were lower class entertainments, quite crude. I think they probably improved as they went along. The Jury is still probably the one that's remembered the most, but it's probably the nastiest as well, but it's also like Casino Royale has a famous last line in terms of the femme fatale, and yet the rights were eventually bought up actually by a British company. As a British producer, Victor Saville. It always amuses me, if you listen to the extras on the Criterion disc, it always makes him sound vaguely aristocratic by calling him Victor Saville. But it's plain old Victor Saville of Park Lane Productions in the UK, who for some reason managed to come up with a deal that he was prepared to go for. And so they had shot Eye of the Jury in 3D, photographed by the great John Alton, one of the masters of noir cinematography, and that is now available. I think you can in fact get it on a 3D Blu-ray finally. I don't think it's a film that makes particularly great use of the 3D format.
I have not seen it in 3D. So, I mean, I have seen that film, and yeah, it's very rough and very simple, very low budget, but there are visual moments to it that are quite beautiful, like, taking advantage of whatever building they were shooting in or whatever. I mean, John Alton was a master. I haven't seen it in 3D, but I have heard some people say that it is the best movie to see in 3D. I mean,
Oh, really?
I would love that opportunity. I have never seen it projected that way. But I mean, I know there's a lot of Biff Elliott playing Mike Hammer, like punching at the camera. So I know that's one 3D effect, but I wonder like how John Alton was playing with atmosphere and architecture. I would love to see it in 3D because that probably is the element that saves it from being totally mundane.
Yeah, I mean, also because of course it belongs to that minor niche subcategory, Christmas noir. Which I find fascinating. Yes. But that's and then we got, I think, The Long Wait, which is an Anthony Quinn movie, which is the only one of those books that have been written up to that point that didn't feature Mike Hammer. But eventually we get to this film that Aldrich, I think, does have control over. So I think he is, in fact, the producer and the director, but it is made for Park Lane. So it's one of this series of adaptations. And right away from the opening shot, from the opening sequence, we know that this is going to be a bit unusual. Should say, credit where credit is due, I suppose, department. The opening sequence is lifted directly from the novel. It's how the novel begins, except it's in New York. Here we're in LA. But apart from that, so it's a different coast. But apart from that, it's woman wearing a trench coat and, it turns out, nothing else, running down a highway at night, and nobody will stop. Nobody will help her. So finally she stands in front of this fantastic sports car that's driving at speed, makes the car veer off the road because she won't move. And who's at the wheel? Mike Hammer, who is extremely upset about what's happened to his car and doesn't give a damn about her whatsoever. It is a sensational opening, and worth pointing out, of course, so the actor playing Mike Hammer is Ralph Meeker, a terrific actor. And even better, perhaps, the actress is Cloris Leachman in her movie debut, which is an amazing debut to have, I think. She certainly comes across very strongly. And then she gets in the car and he's a bit sort of not very happy about it, but he sort of gives her a ride in the end, at which point the credits go in reverse. I think you're supposed to almost think it's like the credits are on the road coming towards you, because it's a shot of the car going forwards and the credits are sort of rolling up instead of down. It's a totally bizarre decision. I mean, but it's certainly very memorable, very arresting. I think right away you know, okay, this is not going to be the usual movie.
If you want to find quirky cinema in the 1950s, like, this is a movie full of quirk like that. And I mean, some critics over the years have accused it of being cheesy, just like too arty, he tries too much. But the way I look at it, I mean, if he hadn't tried all those things, we wouldn't be talking about it right now. I mean, why not? If you're making kind of a low to mid-budget kind of movie, why don't you like throw a lot of spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks, you know? And a lot of this movie does stick. So I think kudos to him for just invigorating what could have been very standard material with so much quirkiness, you know? And I don't know if you've read, Francois Truffaut wrote an essay about this film when it came out, and he loved it. And he said, you know, this is the most innovative American movie that's come out since Orson Welles, the Lady from Shanghai, and we all know that this movie had a big influence on Truffaut and on Jean-Luc Godard, and you could see they pay homage to that opening scene in different movies, like Truffaut does in Shoot the Piano Player, Godard does in Alphaville. They loved it. I mean, this was one of their favorite movies.
I mean, let me just say right away, as an Italian, if you throw spaghetti at the wall and it sticks, it's overcooked. You definitely shouldn't do it that way. Just wanted to get that out of the way. Okay. No, absolutely. I think it's extraordinary. It's an experimental film. They're trying out so many exciting things. One of the things you and I were talking just ahead of recording this was it has a very interesting use of sound throughout the film. And during these opening credits, you've got diegetic music because Hammer turns on the radio and you get Nat King Cole singing the theme song from the film, which will then get played. Well, you'll hear it in a nightclub later on as well. But what's the other big sound effect you can hear? Talk us through that, Mark.
This doesn't get mentioned as much as I think it should. I find it extremely irreverent and surprising. So obviously the Cloris Leachman character, Christina, is out of breath because she's running. She's running for her life on this highway with barefoot and gets picked up by Hammer. And so she's breathing heavily. But I mean, there is no question that this is like this sound that she's making is simulating, a woman making love, a woman almost having an orgasm. I find it extremely shocking, and I think people just take it for granted. I'm like, what the heck is happening here? I mean, you've got Nat King Cole playing on the radio, and you've got Hammer and this woman. And I think in the book, I did get far enough to know that I think there is a little more fooling around between them that goes on in the car than happens in the movie. The only sort of physical contact that they have in the movie is when they run up against these police who've shut the road down, and she grabs his hand as if to say, please don't give me away because the police are looking for me. But yeah, it's a very sexual and I can't think of any other opening like that from a movie 1955 and earlier.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, needless to say, it's all a lot less subtle. She gets his hand and shoves it under her trench coat, and he somehow is able to discover that she's not wearing anything else. So there you go. But yes,
this is why over 55 million Spillane thrillers sold.
But absolutely, that heavy breathing, because also it's not just a little bit of, I mean, she's sort of panting and ansemating. Of course, she's been running on the road. But yes, absolutely, it has a kind of sexual feeling to it, or anyway, a disruptive feeling to it. You're thinking, I can't listen to Nat King Cole because I've got this woman doing heavy breathing sounds over it, and she doesn't quit. It's the entire song. You hear this heavy kind of emotional sound that you cannot ignore. And deep down, that's the aspect of Aldrich's cinema, which is both amazing but occasionally off-putting, because there is that bluntness to his approach sometimes. I remember when I first saw some of his films, in a serious way, which would have been in the 1980s, I was somehow struck by, I felt like he was acting a bit more like a producer and less like a creative director, which is a kind of mean-spirited thing to say. But it was one of the things that it was going so much for shock value, so much for kind of thumping you with something over the head. And it didn't almost matter what kind of film it was, that it sort of detracted. But in actual fact, I think there's such a lot going on here, and this isn't happening casually. There's a boring way to make this film, and then there's the Aldrich way of making this film, and its dynamism, I think, is partly what keeps it alive, makes it so striking even today. And then so we get through these opening credits, which are startling in their own way, and we suddenly realize, this poor woman, she hasn't even got shoes on, so she's just wandering around in this trench coat. And they stop off because it turns out that when he went into the bushes, he managed to get some branches stuck under the undercarriage of the car. So Hammer is really annoyed about that. He's really screwed up with his nice car. But again, it's one of those things that there's clearly the implication that when they go to the gas station that the guy thinks they've probably been canoodling in the bushes, right? So, which is, again, all a bit crude. And then they get back in the car and he sort of, helps her out, because we find out she's escaped from apparently a sanatorium. And for some reason, half the California police force is out looking for her. He pretends that she's his wife. And so they keep going and they pass them through. And then they get pushed off the road by the baddies, who appear out of nowhere. They somehow manage to get ahead of them, cut them off, and they drive them off somewhere else so they can sort of get some kind of information from Christina, who is not called Christina in the book. In the book, she's called Burger Torn. I wonder why they changed that. And Burger Torn, I mean, does that have a cultural reference to you that I'm missing? Because it's just such a weird name.
She was supposed to be a tall, kind of Norwegian or Icelandic woman. I don't know, something like that.
I mean, yeah, okay, fair enough. At which point, horrible things happen. And again, you get that sense of how Aldrich is using the audio, because you get the shot of Hammer who's knocked out. In her case, you just see her legs moving, and they're clearly torturing her, trying to get some information out of her. And I'm not sure how accurate this is. I don't know if this struck you. I only rewatched it a week ago ahead of this podcast, and I'm still not sure if it's accurate, but I've read analyses of it, which they feel that one of the interesting things that Aldrich does is that there's a disjunction between the sound and the legs moving.
No, I have noticed that. Like she's obviously dead, and the screaming keeps going on. Like she's totally limp, and yet we still hear the screaming. So I don't know. I guess they wanted more screaming in, but yeah, it did look like the audio did not match the picture there.
Also, one of the interesting things about the film is that we find out that she gives her name as Christina, but from Christina Rossetti, the poet, which is interesting because there's definitely no poets and no poetry in the original novel. That's definitely part of where the film and the book start to slightly move apart. So quite early on, we've got this early establishing very powerful sequence and we see the shoes of the baddie, right? Which it's, I don't know, they're described as blue suede shoes, are they? Is that what they call them? Which I thought that's not what they look like, but okay. And you hear the voice. Now that we know that the voice belongs to Albert Dekker, but only because we know what Albert Dekker sounds like. But otherwise, not a character that's even remotely been introduced in the narrative. He says, well, you're going to have to get rid of both of them, aren't you? So they are put back into his car, and the car is sort of pushed off the edge of the road and sort of crashes. She's dead already. He doesn't quite die. He ends up in hospital, and at which point Velda is there, his girl Friday, and the assistant in his, it turns out, extremely seedy private eye business, and Pat, who is actually the head of the local police and who's his great buddy. Now, this is all pretty much what's in the book. You know, this is all fine. But then what I find really interesting, and I don't know if you got this far in your reading, which is that this is where the tone really starts to shift, because in the book, after he sort of recovers, he's immediately told that the feds basically want to talk to him. So in the book, it's the FBI. In the film, it's a government agency. Is it the Interstate Crime Commission, I think is what they're calling it, but which is obviously the FBI. So in the book, the FBI basically said, yeah, it's all right. We know you're a good guy and we believe you, not to worry, off you go. It's absolutely ridiculous, basically. But the idea is they're all in on it. They all think he's a great guy. He's a hero. He can do whatever he likes. I mean, there's a reason why Mike Hammer started off as a comic book hero called Mike Danger, right? So he is basically a superhero. And in the film, the tone is very different. Pat won't go in there, won't go into the meeting. So he's sort of being loyal to his friend. But he goes in there and they completely rip him to pieces.
He's a bedroom dick.
He gets information against the wife. Then he makes a deal with the wife to get evidence against the husband.
Thus, playing both ends against the middle.
Just how do you achieve all this? You crawl under beds?
Nothing so primitive.
He has a secretary. At least that's what he calls her.
What's her name, Mr. Hammer?
Velda Wickman.
She's a very attractive young woman. Real woo-bait. Lives like a princess. He sicks her onto the husbands, and before you know it, he's got his evidence, and he's ready for the big squeeze.
Who do you sick onto the wives, Mr. Hammer?
That's his department.
All right, you've got me convinced I'm a real stinker.
I mean, I love that scene. It's so horrible. And sort of Hammer won't even make eye contact, right? He sort of stares off into the fourth wall, actually. So it's a wall we don't see. It's kind of where the camera is. And they're just saying, well, they're telling us, of course, what a kind of despicable excuse for a private eye he really is, right? Because, I mean, tell us more. What does he do for a living? I mean, how do you interpret this, Mark? I mean, I had a pretty clear idea.
Divorce cases. He basically tries to get dirt on husbands for the wives, and so he basically pimps out Velda to get some incriminating evidence on the husbands, And then the implication is he moves in on the wives after. So yeah, it is pretty sleazy. He says, yeah, so I'm a real stinker. And when he leaves, they say, open a window. And I think what's interesting about that scene, and something I didn't really latch onto until my most recent viewing of it, Aldrich had spoken about this, that him, and we have to bring in mention of the screenwriter, A.I. Bezarides, who's a big hero in the story, I think. They were, this is the 1950s, and, they were lefties for sure, and they were bringing up this whole McCarthy witch hunt kind of thing. I think this is an example of like this government agency, like these colorless suits who are like grilling Hammer, and they're snooping into his personal business like Hammer does himself. After that, we see presumably a couple of cops who are tailing Hammer. So anyway, there's a little bit of that 50s paranoia of people being watched and people passing judgment. So I think that's a very interesting scene in the whole film.
One of the things that I find fascinating about that whole side of it as well is that, as you say, it's on the one hand, you're just throwing back onto him the kind of things that he presumably does for a living, because then there's this whole thing about how he uses recordings and surveillance, and it's all very underhand. In fact, even in the book, there's this assumption that somehow even the good guys, they're too slow or whatever, they're too hidebound by their rules. But in the book, it's all about revenge. All the Mike Hammer stories at this point, they're all basically stories of personal revenge of one kind or another. But in this film, it's clearly not about revenge, because he doesn't really care that much about Christina. He's met her for 15 whole minutes or something. So it's about power. He goes to see Velda, doesn't he? And he sort of says, no, this has got the people up in Washington all upset. So basically there's something in this for us. That we, none of this penny ante divorce stuff anymore for us for now. We're going to go for the big time. And she, in fact, is slightly taken aback because she realizes just how risky it is. Now, actually, we should dial back just a moment, because one of the best scenes in the film, certainly the best scene with Cloris Leachman, is of course that scene when she's sitting in the car with him and she starts mocking him, which is just fantastic. She's just sort of saying, oh, you're so narcissistic. All you want is a nice little woman to complete you, but actually all you care about are your nice clothes, your nice car, your expense account, your haircut. You go to the gym to look nice.
You have only one real, lasting love.
Now, who could that be?
You. You're one of those self-indulgent males who thinks about nothing but his clothes, his car, himself. But you do push-ups every morning just to keep your belly hard.
You against good health or something?
I could tolerate flabby muscles in a man and make him more friendly. You're the kind of a person who never gives in a relationship, who only takes. Woman, the incomplete sex. What does she need to complete her? Why, man, of course. Wonderful man.
Oh, all right, let it go.
I like the way they handle it in the film, because it's not like he takes it out on her or anything. He's not upset. He doesn't really care, but they also see it as a weird kind of, okay, I know who you are and you know who I am, because she's probably not a saint either in that sense in the context of the story. But that's just brilliant. I mean, can you imagine, Humphrey Bogart having to put up with that in one of his films? Philip Marlowe and Lauren Bacall just completely tears him to pieces for being, because there you get the joking kind of, well, you're not very tall, are you? That's about as far as the criticism in The Big Sleep goes. Here, it's much tougher. And I think that's sensational. And as you say, I think that's where the Aldrich Bezarides project comes into focus very clearly.
Well, I think that, if you look at Sam Spade or if you look at Philip Marlowe, they're complicated characters, but they're essentially moral. Maltese Falcon has an interesting morality, whereas Sam Spade does what he believes you should do to be perceived to be good. I think that's sort of what he chases to some extent. But these are more moral characters. Like Hammer does not have a moral center, Like he's really in it just to find this great what's-it. He just wants to, as you say, like he knows something that they're chasing has value, so he wants a piece. I think, though, there's an arc to his character throughout the movie. Like I think he sort of gets it the hard way. His friend Nick is going to suffer for helping him out, as is Velda. And I think this sort of wakes him up and shakes him and brings some humanity to him, because until then, like, he just doesn't care about anything except finding a piece of something big, basically.
Yeah, I mean, he's just brash and cocky and just doesn't care. And the fact there is something very interesting, I think quite early on, after he gets out of hospital and after he's sort of been taken apart by the Interstate Crime Commission, he goes back to his apartment. And again, like Christina had said about him, of course, he's got a fabulous apartment. He's got the latest tech. He's got an answering phone, a reel-to-reel audio tape answering phone built into his wall, which is insane. Can you imagine trying to fix that? But nonetheless, you know, it looks fantastic. It's sort of Irwin Allen, you know, Danger Will Robinson kind of stuff, and it's fantastic. You know, he kind of kisses Velda. She's very worried about him, and then she sort of wanders off for him, and she also says, "Be careful you don't get blown over by a kiss." And he just sort of lies there out on his sofa, and he's not sure quite what's going on. And there is this quite telling line of dialogue, I think, where he sort of says he's not sure how he feels. He's not sure he's completely over his accident. I think that feeds into what you're saying, is that oddly enough, there's some kind of little crisis going on here. It doesn't stop him being violent and nasty and sadistic, but at the same time, he's off center. The world that he thinks he inhabits, which is after all kind of low-level divorce stuff, which presumably doesn't too often lead to murder and mayhem, and let's face it, this is not where he usually is. And in the book, no problem, because in the book it's sort of accepted that it's okay for him to go out and kill people because it's him, so that's all right. Here, it's not that at all, and in fact he's constantly being questioned and having that sort of thing thrown back at his face. So I find that, as you say, very interesting and intriguing, because it's a bit too easy to just sort of smack him and sort of say you're just his kind of one-dimensional tool, which he kind of is, but that's where the critique comes in. I think that's what's interesting about the film, because Mike Hammer isn't just Mike Hammer. Mike Hammer is also acquisitive Eisenhower-era consumerist male who is doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be going out and making lots of money. You're supposed to be a fortune hunter, or in this case, literally a treasure hunter. You're supposed to be the hunter-gatherer. You're supposed to get a lovely new apartment, spend lots of money on consumables. It's the dream, right? That's what you're supposed to be doing. And yet everybody's telling him what a horrible human being he is. And he's behaving accordingly. So I find that very intriguing. For, as you say, it's 1955. It's amazing. I mean, in a way, it belongs almost more to like Douglas Sirk films of that era that are going to slightly have a go at, you know, the seeming normality, the bourgeois reality that we're supposed to all buy into in kind of middle-class cinema. And instead, you've got this kind of force of nature. But also, there is this interesting imbalance, because Velda goes off and he's left slightly, you know, he's a bit sort of iffy about it. He's feeling strange. And then he goes off and walks the streets and he's got a tail on him. At which point, things get extremely violent. And it's not the only time, right, where he kind of spends time with a woman. Things don't necessarily go quite according to plan. And then he goes and beats the crap out of somebody. There's a kind of interesting psychoanalytical dynamic going on here. It is a fascinating scene as well. I mean, it's very violent. I mean, there is that sadistic element to Hammer. I think it's the first time you really see it, because this guy's, I mean, I think he's going to try and kill him, right? He's got a knife, but he gets it away from him by throwing popcorn in his face. I mean, works for me, right? You know, and then he just keeps smacking his head against this wall. And again, it's very excessive. I think, for instance, in the UK, you know, where censorship, particularly for things like violence, was even tougher than it was in the US at the time, a lot of that got cut out.
It's interesting what you said earlier about violence shouldn't really be his currency, because he's mostly involved in divorce cases. However, he is like the ultimate killing machine in this movie. Like, nobody can touch this guy, really. And what's interesting is Mike Hammer is known to always have a 45. In this movie, his gun is confiscated very early on because he's not cooperating with the police. So he has no gun, but that doesn't slow him down. Like, the guy that pulls a knife on him, you know, ends up presumably dead as a result of the encounter. And Mike Hammer, like, beats the hell out of various characters throughout this film. So he's scary. Like, I mean, he just seems to know these moves where he can knock somebody unconscious, you know, in 2 seconds, you know. It's and I think he puts it across. Like you believe how tough that he is.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a haircut that's almost a bit too short. It kind of stands up slightly, and it's kind of like this guy is so ferocious that even the haircut is scared and frightened backwards. No, and in fact, there's that great scene when he goes to the house of what turns out to be one of the main bad guys, Paul Stewart's sort of nice place, and the two henchmen go then to sort of go and have words with him, and one of them goes in, and you don't see what happens. Instead, they focus on Jack Elam's face, and he's kind of horrified by whatever it is Mike Hammer's just done to him. And the only reason why you have to assume that it's probably judo or something, or martial arts, is because you get a little bit of Oriental style plinky plonky music from Frank Duvall on the soundtrack. Otherwise, you have no idea what he just did to him. Which I love that. Basically, he's mysteriously horrible. Because you get these explosions of violence. They're not always from him, but it's a film that is deliberately unstable in how it wants to present its story, I think. Instability is a kind of a recurring motif in the film, where something really scary might just happen just round any corner, and it's going to make you really kind of take a breath and sort of say, ooh, yeah, that's not nice. It's sort of, I can't just enjoy it. It's not just a PI on the job anymore. No, this is, there's something far more brutal, far more primal going on here. I mean, again, it's one of those differences between the book and the film, because in the book, he kills a lot more people in the book, and it's all fine. He basically gets absolution from his friend and the police. He sort of said, yeah, it's all right. I knew it was you. He had it coming. It's okay. Whereas, admittedly, even in that scene where he throws him down the stairs, I mean, he just looks at him a bit and then just wanders off. And it's never brought up ever again. It's not like somebody's going to go and say, yeah, you know that guy you killed? None of that. But in fact, the fact that his PI license is taken away and his gun, odd enough, that's actually from the book, for instance. I mean, there are quite a number of elements that survive the transition. And yet there is this massive critique of where the book is coming from, the kind of endless commie bashing. Although, and you don't really get it in the film, in the book it's the mafia, and the mafia are the bad guys, and there are these long stretches of dialogue in which he talks about the mafia. And one of my favorite bits, and I've got a quote from it because I think it's hilarious, he says, "The mafia, the stinking slimy mafia, an oversized mob of ignorant lunk-headed jerks." I love that.
Wrong language.
I know. Harsh, right? I mean, that's...
The violence is disturbing. Like in that case, I mean, there is a self-defense element to it, like you say. I mean, the guy pulls a knife on him, the guy's trying to kill him. There are other scenes where he's just throughout the course of his investigation, like he's picking up all these threads, he's interviewing all these people, and he uses violence against a lot of them. And some of them are like old men, like pretty defenseless. There's that scene where he visits the opera singer played by Fortuno Bonanova, who is in Citizen Kane, and he threatens him by breaking like his prized Caruso record. That's a shocking moment. Like that sort of really makes you unsympathetic to Hammer when he does that. And then there's this scene with Percy Helton, who plays the morgue attendant. He goes to visit Christina's body because there's a clue, and Percy Helton keeps wanting money from Hammer. Hammer keeps paying. He's like, no, you're not getting any more. The guy's like, well, you're not getting the key. And so then he slams the door, the drawer, I should say, on his hands. And Percy Helton, this little guy, mole-looking little guy, is like squealing in pain, and Hammer keeps pushing the drawer in, and he's smiling. Like he's definitely sadistic, like you say. And then there's a scene soon after. It's like he's lost all his patience with everybody. And there's a scene where he goes to the athletic club because he has this key that he got from Christina's body and figured out, where to find what you put this key into. And so he goes to this athletic club, and there's this old guy, very proper, at the front desk. And Hammer goes, do you recognize this key? And the guy, are you a member, sir? Like this very snotty guy. And he just grabs this guy by the shirt and slaps him around. Now, I want to argue this because nobody seems to ever say this. I find this movie to be very funny. I think it's a dark comedy in a lot of places. Like, I think that scene is hilarious because it's so outrageous that Mike Hammer is beating up like this elderly man. Like, it's so out of pocket, as the kids say today. And then when the guy says, okay, I'll show you in the locker room, and he walks off, the crumpled dollar bill or whatever that Hammer put on
he takes it back, right? Yeah.
He puts it in his pocket. I think that is grand comedy. I don't know if anybody agrees with me on that, but I find there are moments songs like that are so dark they're hilarious.
No, I agree. Absolutely. I think that because it's such an exaggerated figure, and he does seem to sort of pick on he definitely punches down most of the time, doesn't he? You know, so it's kind of like he picks on people who are like 20 years older than him or more and really gives them a hard time. And I'm thinking, that's not very nice, Mike. I mean, tut tut, you know, but but you're not supposed to. But it's true. I think the breaking of the record is a cruel moment. I mean, in a way, it's nice he doesn't do anything worse to him, but he only breaks one record. I mean, in fact, you know what it reminded me of? There's this scene in the bandwagon where he's trying to stamp on some records and he can't break them. The Fred Astaire character, sorry, I should say. And not Ava Gardner, sorry. Sid Charisse walks in and she manages to crack one by mistake. And he says, you wouldn't be able to do it if I hadn't softened it up for you. But then, of course, you get the ballet scene in the bandwagon, which is this great spoof of the kind of the Mike Hammer thing. And I think it was written by Alan J. Lerner. He was asked to write that. He doesn't get a credit, I don't think, but it's the Girl Hunt ballet. And I think Lerner said something along the lines of, yes, I just read one of the Mike Hammer books and my eyes were still watering when I wrote the script.
Another page in the case book of Rod Riley was finished. The city was asleep, the joints were closed, the rats and the hoods and the killers were in their holes. I felt good, but something was missing. She was bad. She was dangerous. I wouldn't trust her any farther than I could throw her. But she was my kind of woman.
That sequence is just wonderful.
Yeah, no, I love that movie. And again, it's interesting because that's 1953. So that's 2 years before this. And already they're kind of mocking it as being a bit ridiculous. In a way, there is a kind of perhaps natural progression here towards the kind of absorbing the jet black humor of it into the narrative in a way by sort of making him not exactly a figure of fun, but at the same time, he kind of doesn't really know what he's after. I mean, Velda calls it the great what's it, which is, we would just call it, the son of Mr. and Mrs. MacGuffin. They're just looking for something because Mike says, I'm sure I can make money from this because it's a treasure of some kind. It's a treasure hunt story. Everybody's after it. I just want to get there first so that I can realize something from whatever this is. But he has absolutely no clue, which I kind of love. In the context of the book, it's just meant to be leading to a kind of surprise. It's this idea of, you'll find out what the big thing. And what does it turn out to be in the book? It's a box full of drugs. It's about $2 million worth of heroin. In the novel, it's been there. Sorry, guys, if you haven't read the book. But it's been in there apparently for something close to 15 years. He's been hanging on to it, basically, since before America entered the war. It's now doubled in value. So in other words, he's not only had $2 million worth of drugs, presumably heroin, in there in this box, but he hasn't touched it. So he's just letting it sit there to accumulate in value. And for the whole 15 years, the mafia's been really pissed off about it and really wants to get it back. But they know who got it, but they can't knock him off because they really want those drugs. And you're just thinking, this is utterly ridiculous. Now, apparently, you couldn't use drugs as a plot point because of restrictions in the production code at the time. According to Aldrich, anyway, in interviews, he was like, no, well, we couldn't use that, so we had to come up with a different treasure, which is how they came up with what they came across. Now, before we get to that, I mean, you mentioned, obviously, he finds the locker where the big treasure is being held. It's presented, it's fairly late in the narrative. We've got new characters in. We've got the Lily character as well. She's the roommate of Christine. So he's now sort of trying to help her out as well. So there's her and Christine and Velda, these three women. In the film, we get to the point where he's zeroing in finally on, and it's not going to be a box full of drugs, which is supremely uncinematic, obviously. And instead, he opens it up and he puts his hand on the box and he says,
It's hot.
Hot, sir?
Now, I don't know about you, but rewatching it, I suddenly thought, this is still one of the most thrilling bits of cinema I have ever seen. is just so completely unexpected. It's so perfect and so wild. And it's just fantastic because then, of course, he opens it. And it's kind of, what the bloody hell was that? And I think that's incredible. I mean, what was it like when you first saw that? It took me straight back to when I first saw that. And I thought, oh my God, that just blew my mind.
So he opens the box, and I mean, it's amazing what a little light in that box, and like a very loud hissing sound and a little dry ice or whatever can accomplish. But yeah, I guess the soundtrack really sells it too. It's just this loud hissing sound, this glow like comes out. And then he shuts the box quickly because obviously it's hot and it's dangerous. But yeah, all of a sudden this takes this film into a whole other plane. Like I mean, it sort of takes it into science fiction land. I agree with you. It is really just a stunning moment in film history, and yeah, it sets this story on a whole new path.
I mean, also, it's become the ultimate film buff reference in other movies. I mean, so it's sort of, you get it in Raiders of the Lost Ark, you get it in Repo Man, you get it in Pulp Fiction. Lost Highway, of course, channels this film in all kinds of ways. The David Lynch movie is extraordinary because, as you say, I think, again, it's the sound design, which is genuinely interesting because there is this kind of growling sound that goes with it, along with a kind of sort of space AG type sort of electronic sound. Genuinely threatening. And it's just extraordinary. And I just, this is so cool. And again, utterly baffles Mike. He's got no clue. But in fact, it's been, unless I've misunderstood it and misread it, so you tell me, there's a scene where he goes and talks to a friend, well, a journalist who also knew Christina, I think, and he's got these scars on his face. And the camera, again, it's one of those things where it made me think, okay, Aldrich could have saved us this a little bit because it really tracks in on this sort of horrible thing on the side of his face. But then after he's closed that box very quickly, he gets a sort of welt on his arm because of the extreme heat. And you're thinking, oh, that's what that was. At least I think that's what I was supposed to think. I thought he's been beaten up really badly, but I thought maybe he'd seen it too.
Yeah, I've never thought of it that way. I thought it was more that he was being intimidated, that he was being beaten up for talking, and he Ray Diker is the character, and he provides Hammer with a lot of the clues that Hammer pursues, and then I guess he gets intimidated to the point where he's not giving Hammer the information, and then Hammer starts getting violent with him too. It's a confusing narrative because this Ray Diker character sets him, like, he goes to visit like the guy that owns the boxing ring. He visits like a trucker who accidentally hit a guy named Kowalski. I've always had a hard time trying to keep straight, like, who are all these people and how do they tie into the main narrative. I think ultimately some of them are kind of dead ends, and it's just a question of what the filmmakers are doing is just they're showing like all these threads that he's pursuing, and some are dead ends and some are not, and they're all interesting. Like all these, like, what a cast. We mentioned Fortuna Bonanova, Paul Stewart, Juano Hernandez is a great actor who plays that guy that owns the
terrific little scene. And I think it's a sequence shot as well, right? I think it's just one very, very long take, I think, where they have their conversation. But that's it, unfortunately. He's only in that one scene, but he's terrific.
One of the reasons why the French New Wave directors like this film, because it seemed that Aldrich and his cinematographer, Ernst Laszlo, great cinematographer, they're sort of acting a bit like jazz musicians. I mean, they're going to these locations in Los Angeles. Some of it was shot on stage. A lot of it was shot on location. They go to a location like a boxing match. And then you have this shot. It starts on this very interesting, tall African-American man in a suit who's like leaving and going down the stairs. So it starts with him. It follows him. And then it picks up Hammer on the way up. There's no point to it necessarily, but it's almost like they got to this place and like, okay, you walk down the stairs. Like, you're interesting, walk down the stairs. Like, they seem to be improvising and taking advantage of these locations and these extras and these characters. And then, the camera follows Hammer, and he has this one take scene with Juano Hernandez. And there are many instances like that. I mean, there's a great scene where he goes to Christina's apartment and he helps an old man. One of his nicer gestures.
Yeah.
He helps this old man with his heavy case up the stairs. But then there's like these unorthodox shots, that take advantage of the arches in this old house and stained glass and all this. It just seems to me that, they get there and they're taken by the environment and they're reacting to the environment. And I think that's part of what makes this movie so vibrant. They are reacting almost in real time to what is in front of them.
Going back to a point you made earlier, which is that Bessarides and Aldrich were fundamentally quite liberal filmmakers within an era where that was, more than frowned upon. It stopped you working. You get these two scenes where both the gym and then the club, which are entirely run by African Americans. And what's nice is that actually it's the Dillon scenes where you get Mike and he's just one of the guys. It's a completely level playing field. He's just there. He's basically amongst friends. That was very unusual. And in fact, the nightclub scene got into weird censorship problems because, again, they're singing the theme song again, which we'd heard earlier with Nat King Cole. The way that the singer is holding the microphone was considered to be suggestive, and so that had to be re-edited, if you can imagine. I mean, this is one of those films that frustratingly exists in multiple cuts because of a lot of these bizarre changes that were made to assuage particular censorship boards in different parts of the US during its release and things like that. But I always thought that was actually a really interesting scene because those scenes last several minutes and they're quite substantial, but it's quite nice because Mike has a nice chat with the barman and he knows the singer and they all talk to each other, and these are rare moments in American cinema of the mid-1950s. Even if you've got Sidney Poitier in movies, it's never handled that way. It's never about going into a bar and having a chat with someone. And I always thought, well, that's another thing you don't expect maybe to see in a film quite like this. It tells you where our filmmakers are coming from, and I think it's one of the things that helps the film stand up. Equally, I think, technically, I think a lot of it's very impressive. Actually, I was going to ask your opinion as someone who knows a bit about cinematography, because I think, I don't know if you've got the Criterion Blu-ray release of Kiss Me Deadly. So I watched it listening to the audio commentary by Alan Silver and James Orsini, who, of course, know their film noir very well. They talk about the fact that in the opening shots of the film, when we get the shots with Mike and Christina in the car, they keep saying that was done in back projection. They are flat out wrong. It's definitely not back projection. It's definitely shot on location. I think they maybe meant to go back and maybe redo some pickups. So I think there's probably paperwork to say they were on the stage doing stuff, but there is no back projection in any of those shots. Please agree with me, Mark.
Well, I did the same thing. I listened to their commentary recently, and I was surprised that they had said that because I never thought that was the case. So it made me give pause. I'm not sure. I don't know the exact answer. I never thought that it was a rear projection shot. And certainly there are car mount shots in that sequence, like you see from behind when they pull up to where the road is blocked by the police. That's definitely a rear mount shot. And that's one of the great things, it's not like they invent that technique, but I mean, it was a bit more rare in 1955 to mount the camera on top of the car. But I mean, it gives it a real sense of realism. And there are other moments, in this film that are very exciting because they go to the lengths of mounting. Like there's just a scene where Hammer's he has a clue and he leaves in his car. Maybe it's with a roommate.
Is it Lily? I am getting the name right, aren't I?
Lily
She's got
Carver.
two names, of course, but yeah.
Yeah, played by Gabby Rogers, right?
Yeah.
The car, he reverses it and he takes off. There's moments like that. It's exciting. It really propels the action forward in an exciting way. So yeah, I was surprised when they said that was a rear projection shot, but I don't know conclusively.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why, I'm flat out sure they're wrong, but one of the reasons why is because you can see the cars moving behind them. Headlights create flares in the lens. It's not going to happen with rear projection. It has to be a real light shooting into the camera.
If they were going to do rear projection, I think the lighting would be better. It looked like
Yes.
they had a couple of lights. It looks like they had a couple of lights on the floor of the car, on the dashboard or something that were lighting their faces. Looked pretty real to me.
Yeah, no, I was really curious to get your opinion because I thought, really? Nah, you're wrong. But I can't wait to get an email from them telling me I'm a complete jerk. But that's okay. They're allowed to say that. We're trying not to spoil absolutely everything about this film because the ending is utterly sensational, utterly unforgettable, unique in the genre. All these things are true. It has all these kind of interesting mythological and biblical references that it actually started quite early on because you get this scene after he survives the kind of car crash at the beginning of the film that his mechanic friend Nick sort of says, it's like you're like Lazarus, he came back from the dead, things like that. They start coming in quite early, and then you get references to Pandora's box and Medusa and Lot's wife and all these sorts of things. And then you get to the ending, which is, oddly enough, is in fact the same ending as the book, in the sense that you get the reveal of who the guy with the shoes was, which is meant to be a big surprise. And then, to give Spillane credit, it's one of those things where it's a character you've never actually been introduced to. They exist in the narrative, but you've never actually introduced them face to face. So all of a sudden, it's them. I went, oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't expect that, because I thought you didn't give it any prominence. So that was impressive. But the other thing is that then you get the big conflagration, which again is rationalized in a different way, because the box doesn't have the same stuff in it, but you achieve the same result. The same people shoot the same people. It's the same basic setup. But when you saw it, so you would have seen the cut version of the print, the one at the end where it makes it look like the whole world's going up in a big mushroom cloud. Yes.
Yeah, that was the version. I don't know when that replaced the original version, because people had mentioned a different version, a longer ending before. But in my time of seeing this movie, we're talking late 1980s to early 2000s. Like that was the version that was available. It was much talked about. I mean, people who don't want spoilers can turn off now, but I mean, I guess we have to say, there is a nuclear element of some kind in this box that will explode. I always thought it was a very metaphorical ending, because we get this mushroom cloud, we get the end coming towards us like on screen, and that was it. And you're like, wow, wow, that's a really shocking and unconventional ending, and very bleak. But then in 2002, I think the Directors Guild discovered a reel, I think from Aldrich's personal collection, that had 82 seconds of an extended ending, in which we actually see Hammer and Velda get out of this beach house where she's being held and go to the beach. So they get out of harm's way, we think. It's still a very up in the air kind of ending, but significantly different that the two of them get out and run into the ocean while this explosion happens. Because we thought like Hammer and everybody was lost in this explosion, but no. But we still don't know what the aftermath of these events is.
Well put. Because I think that's absolutely it, is that although you get the sense that they get away from the house, so they're not in the conflagration, you still get the impression that things may not turn out to be that great. On the other hand, they're there in the waves, and somehow maybe that suggests some kind of cleansing. But yeah, it's this odd thing that eventually we got this other version, and you can see how that is obviously the right version. It's how it's supposed to end, and Aldrich confirmed it. He sort of said, that's the only ending I ever saw. There seems to have been a difference between the version released in the UK and the US, for instance. But again, it does seem odd, doesn't it? It's kind of like you've deliberately re-edited it to make it even more nihilistic, which you got to admit, you don't often read that. Usually it's the opposite, right?
Who did that? The mystery here is, who did that? Who cut it like that?
And also because they just took shots out. It looks very disjointed and very odd, because there's just stuff missing. It's very peculiar. So there's kind of decades of people writing about this extraordinary film, because for a lot of writers on film noir who look at it from a kind of historical perspective, and I don't entirely agree with this, but they kind of feel like it's the film that kind of brings down the curtain on the classic film noir period. It's kind of where Paul Schrader sits in Notes on Film Noir, his amazing article, or the Borneschot, their panorama of film noir cinema that was originally published in French. And you get this sense that it's sort of 41 to 55. I actually think film noir goes on for about another decade, actually. But I don't really want to exclude things like Touch of Evil from 1958 or Odds Against Tomorrow in 1959. They're too important to say, oh, they're not noir. Says no, they're totally crucial works, apart from anything else, because they very importantly introduce the kind of racial dimension to it. And you have to have that in both those films. So they handle it in completely different ways, but that's part of the story in both of those. And so they're very important. I'm not necessarily one of those people who would include Psycho as a noir. I always find that a little bit strange. It's kind of gothic horror thriller, but not really noir, but not for me anyway. Nonetheless, you can see why the attractiveness of trying to shutting it down, because it has that apocalyptic finale. In a way, it's interesting because apparently Aldrich's own position on the film changed. I don't know if you were reading this. There's a really good article about the film by Edward Gallifant in which he talks about how, I think in 1956, Aldrich was asked about it and he was very dismissive about the film. He basically said, I shouldn't have made it. It was a mistake. I have no pride in it. And he really literally shrugs it off as being, it was just another one of those Mike Hammer films being made by Victor Saville. And that was because you think, well, that's in the context of the film that's just come out. It's failed commercially. It's failed critically. He's thinking about other things. He's putting it behind him. He's doing the traditional thing. He's going to start making Attack and all these other films. And the truth is, he's not going to have a big hit at the box office for about another 7 years. So he's going to be working hard. And then at the end of the 60s, he's asked again, or there's an interview where he talks about it, where he in fact reclaims it and sort of says, no, that's a film I'm extremely proud of, but we completely rewrote everything. Bezzerides and I just took the premise and threw everything away. Well, factually, that's not accurate, but at the same time, you can see, I mean, I think he's right. I think he deserves to take great pride in it. It's a special film. But at the same time, it's sort of interesting, isn't it, how those things shift? You know, by that point, he was very successful, done The Dirty Dozen. He was at the top of his career from a commercial standpoint. So it's interesting how he was able to sort of say, yeah, okay, I don't mind. It was a great film.
Yeah, I think we need to do a deeper dive on the box office, because from the figures that I have seen, and this surprised me because this is more of a recent find, I think it did quite well at the box office. We tend to think of it, oh, this film was way ahead of its time. It was just seen as another Mike Hammer movie, and then it was discovered by the French or whatever. I don't know if that's true. I think the movie was actually pretty successful at the box. I think it doubled its budget, at least at the box office. And not to mention did pretty well in France, probably spurred on by the reviews in the Cahiers du Cinéma. So I don't know. I think that maybe that narrative needs to be rewritten. It's also worth mentioning, so this movie came under fire from the Legion of Decency, along with another film called The Big Combo by Joseph Lewis. So these came out at the same time, and that's another movie that pushes the envelope sexually in terms of violence. So they both, you know, and Aldrich felt he was a bit under fire for having made this movie. So he responded. He wrote a magazine article about, like, this is society that's violent. You know, don't come after me because we live in a violent society. I'm just reflecting it. I mean, certainly they do not embrace the Mike Hammer character, and that's the glory of it. They don't embrace it. They're critical of the Mike Hammer character. There are certain characters in this film that I think are a little bit of the mouthpiece for the filmmakers, like Christine at the beginning, as you mentioned earlier. She gives a critique of Hammer, and Pat Murphy, as they call him here. He's known as Pat Chambers in the books, but Pat Murphy tells him that he's an idiot, and then basically he just, like, you know, blasted his way through this mess, you know, not knowing that he was getting involved with something connected with Los Alamos Trinity Manhattan Project, and even if he had known, it wouldn't have made any difference. He still would have acted the way that he did, you know. So I think they got their political points across. You know, as far as Aldrich goes, I have to say, like, his bombastic style that some people criticize is perfect for this movie. This movie is a smack in the head. I don't love any of Robert Aldrich's movies nearly as much as this one. So I think he was perfectly matched to it. And I think Bezzerides did a fantastic job with the screenplay, because he had disdain for this book that he had to adapt. And I think he worked miracles with it.
It was very historically interesting to read the book, and I'm glad I did. I don't imagine I will be rereading it anytime soon. But in this case, I think the film, it stands up superbly. And now at least we've got proper access to the correct version with all its greatness and all its flaws. And I mean, I don't think it's got a particularly good music score. I never understood why Aldrich was so attached to Frank DeVol as his composer. He didn't do all his films, but he did an awful lot of them. But it does tend to be, you know, a little on the unsubtle side. But he wrote pretty tunes. He wrote nice songs. But I never thought he was as great for sort of dramatic scoring, particularly.
I do love the song, though. I'd rather have the blues than what I've got. And I've been trying to get to the bottom of this. I think the song was commissioned for the film. Like, I don't see any history of it prior to this. In fact, on eBay, for like $30 or whatever it is, you could get a single, like a preview single, and they call the song Blues from Kiss Me Deadly. I think it's a great song. And, you know, Nat King Cole and Frank DeVol of course, worked with Nat King Cole. He arranged the great song Nature Boy in 1947, 48, #1 hit. So we start with Frank Duvall, and then we have Kitty White, whom you mentioned earlier, singing that song in the bar that happens. And it's a great song. It fits this movie really well. And it's like, I don't just have the blues. I have something greater than the blues. To me, this is what the movie's all about. This movie's going further. Like things are not just bad. They're really bad. You know what I mean?
I think that is the perfect place to end our podcast on Kiss Me Deadly. Thanks so much for joining me on repraising and talking about this great movie. It's been really terrific. And yes, it's its 70th anniversary in 2025, and everybody should go out and see it at least once. But in actual fact, I think it's one of those films where you can watch it many, many times and get a lot out of it. You don't have to love your protagonist to love the movie. I think that's the truth of the film. But as you say, I think that there is an interesting kind of tonal shift in how you feel about Mike Hammer. You actually start feeling a bit sorry for him. He does have a pretty hard time of it by the end of the movie. But anyway, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast, Mark. It's been really great.
Thanks so much, Sergio. Great fun talking about one of my cinematic obsessions.
We must do this again sometime, mate.
Let's do it.
Thank you. Bye-bye. You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.